When the National Party came to power in 1948, South Africa already was segregated, as were many other places at that time. But the National Party went much further, building a unique form of institutional racism, morally rooted in religion, codified in law, enforced by force. Among the most powerful tools of repression, pass laws that required blacks to produce their papers at any moment or be thrown in jail.
If you are born white, then you are born into privilege and power. And if you were born black, which the majority of us, the 84% are black, then you had no rights whatsoever.
Apartheid divided the races even down to who you could marry, who you could have sex with. In 1949, marriages between whites and blacks were forbidden. By 1953, different races were ordered to use separate buses, separate restaurants, separate post offices, separate toilets, separate beaches. For blacks, a life of constantly guarding against being caught in the web of regulations and random pass checks.
Life in South Africa was just a tragedy, risky, dangerous, all the time. When you leave home in the morning, children go to school, husband, wife go to work, you never know whether you're going to see each other in the evening.
Apartheid is based on the theory that different races were never meant to live together. At its heart is the Afrikaner religious belief that they were the chosen people, to be set apart, to do God's will.
They drew on the Bible as a justification, which has since, of course, been repudiated by the Dutch Reformed Church, but only comparatively recently.
In 1959, the government unveiled a plan to make South Africa's black majority disappear forever. They would be moved to tribal homelands and then declared South Africans no longer. Eventually, 10 homelands were shoehorned into areas whites were willing to give up, only 13% of the country. So while the whites are imposing apartheid, what happened to the black resistance? The struggle against apartheid never stopped, but in 1960 it changed. In Sharpville on March 21st, 1960, during a non-violent protest against pass laws that restricted virtually every move a black person made, white policemen opened fire. 69 blacks died, setting off protests around the country and the world.
It was a turning point in that it became clear that we could no longer oppose the government using, extra parliamentary methods that are acceptable in normal democracies.
So the armed resistance began. A young lawyer named Nelson Mandela spearheaded the ANC's military branch. In 1964, he was sentenced to life in prison for waging guerrilla war against the government.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
Years of fierce repression followed. Then came Soweto, 1976.
A bunch of students in Soweto got together protesting the use of Afrikaans in schools, and they created such a stir that the government called out troops and really was forced to bear its teeth. And people thought, if a bunch of high school students could do this, well, maybe if we all worked a little bit more, we could really change apartheid.
More than 550 people died, 4,000 were wounded. The outrage fueled by Soweto quickly spread to other townships and abroad. For the first time, the resistance made headlines around the world. More international pressure came in 1977 after student leader Steve Biko died suspiciously while in detention. But outside sanctions didn't really start to take hold till the 1980s. Inside South Africa, activists resisted more fiercely than ever.
The struggle in South Africa was so intense, inside the country now. In the 80s, there were mass demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations. The civic associations, these just ordinary people in the townships and in rural areas, they engaged in consumer boycotts and rent boycotts and so. In other words, a situation was created where people rendered themselves ungovernable, and the government lost control totally over people.
So why did apartheid collapse? Was it the black resistance? Was it economic sanctions? Was it the end of the Cold War? Or did it just become clear that it was no longer morally acceptable?
I think the use of force in the mid-'80s, the declaration of 2 states of emergency, the jailing of 25,000 people, the daily death toll in shooting in the townships at the hands of police who were ostensibly trying to restore peace, I think really shook the moral foundations of apartheid.
I think the 80s, when the Dutch Reformed Church said apartheid was a sin, and this was the beginning of the end of apartheid.
The sanctions were taking a bite on the economy. And again, de Klerk was pragmatic, and he realized that, and then he had to deal with that.
The collapse of communism elsewhere in the world, and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, convinced him that the communist side of black liberation movements was going to be weakened, and therefore he could talk to blacks without fear that it would mean some kind of communist takeover, which was a deep-set fear amongst the white community in South Africa.
It's very hard to explain his change of heart, if there has been one. He certainly had a change of, as I said, of intellect, of head, where he had the courage to make some very, very tough choices, much tougher ones than Mandela. He really has given up everything, and Mandela has just had to hold fast to what he believes in. De Klerk had to give up everything he believed in.
The end of apartheid came in steps. In 1985, interracial marriages are allowed. In 1989, mixed neighborhoods. But the real beginning of the end doesn't come until 1990. When we return, a now gray-haired Nelson Mandela is set free, a new era, but the bloodshed is far from over.